With just a few simple ingredients, you can make this foolproof, crusty Italian bread. So what is Italian bread? Well, for starters, it's not just one thing. Depending on where you are in Italy, you'll find different types of bread. There's focaccia, ciabatta. In Tuscany, they're known for not adding any salt to their bread. In the south, in regions like Matera, they use a durum wheat flour instead of the white flour. But in America, what we come to know as Italian bread is a bread that has a thin but crusty exterior, a soft interior that's good for sopping up olive oil or the sauce at the end of your meal. So that is what I'm making today. I'm making it a little extra crispy because that is what we prefer. But this is the Italian bread that you have come to know at a restaurant or maybe in your household. But just to be clear, there is not one bread that is in all of Italy. It varies greatly depending on region. But this is a bread that we love in our house, and I want to show you how to make today. So I do have my stand mixer here, but this is completely optional. It can be done by hand. It takes a little bit longer and a little more messy and hands-on, obviously. The dough hook attachment I find to work great, but again, it's not necessary if you're making this bread. I have my first few ingredients, and my goal today is to not only show you how to make this bread, but to explain some of the steps in bread making and kind of the why behind it, so that whether you make this recipe or another recipe, you know what steps not to skip, things not to do, and how to set yourself up for success when making bread. In the bowl of my stand mixer, I'm going to start with adding warm water. Next, I'm going to add honey. Here I have active dry yeast. When you are shopping for yeast, make sure that you get active dry for this recipe. It is not the same as instant yeast, so make sure when you are reading your recipe through, you identify whether it calls for instant yeast or active dry. I'm going to pour the active dry yeast over the water and honey mixture. Now I'm using warm water because the active dry yeast has a coating on the exterior, which allows it to be dried and shelf stable. And the warm water helps dissolve the coating on it. The reason I'm using warm water and not hot water is because this is technically a live ingredient. So if you were to use hot water, it would kill the yeast. The ideal temperature is about 100 to 110 degrees, which is slightly warmer than body temperature. Now the reason I'm using honey in this mixture is because it gives the yeast something to kind of feed off of, and it kind of jumpstarts the yeast process. I'm going to use this whole packet and just pour it right over the water. You just want to give this a few minutes to get foamy to ensure that your yeast is in fact live. The last thing you want to do is add all the other ingredients and waste flour if you have kind of a bad batch of yeast. 9 times out of 10, the yeast is fine, but again, it could be the water is too hot or it was just a bad batch of the yeast and you don't want to get all the way down the recipe and realize that you have to start over again. So we'll give it a few minutes and see if it gets foamy, and then we'll start with the rest of the ingredients. The yeast has started foaming, so I know I have a good active dry yeast, and I'm going to start adding the bread flour and the salt to the mixture. Here I'm using bread flour. Bread flour has a higher protein percentage than traditional all-purpose flour. I prefer this. I think it helps the bread maintain its structure and a nice hearty loaf. You certainly can use all-purpose flour. The measurements would be the same. So I'm going to add this right into the stand mixer, followed by the salt. Now all we have to do is start the stand mixer and run it on medium for about 5 to 6 minutes. Make sure once the stand mixer starts running that you push down any bits of flour that are stuck to the side so that it's all incorporated. You'll know that the dough is not too wet because it's pulling away from the sides now. It's not sticking to the sides, and it will be a moist dough. We'll add some flour to our work surface when we start to knead it, but otherwise the edges of the bowl are pretty clean, so you'll know that the dough is the right consistency. If it is sticking to the side of the bowl, this is when you'll add a little bit more flour if you need to, but not a lot, about a tablespoon at a time. Now that this is mixed, I'm going to lift and just scrape off any last bits that are on the dough hook. I'm going to pour this out onto a floured cutting board, so I'm just going to move my stand mixer out of the way and on to the next step. I have my cutting board here as my work surface, and what I like to do is keep a little bit of flour on the side in a separate bowl. We're going to flour the work surface, and as needed to make the dough a little less sticky, we'll use flour. If you don't, you're going to have sticky hands and find yourself reaching into your bag of flour for just a little bit extra. Trust me, have some bench flour on the side. You're going to need it. You don't want to have those sticky hands reaching in cabinets and looking for a little bit more flour. So I'll start by putting the flour on my cutting board. Perfect. And now we'll get that dough out of the mixer and put it onto the cutting board. Although the stand mixer does most of the work, what we still have to do is knead it a little bit and form it into a ball so that it is ready for its first rise. So I'm going to add a little more flour on top. And feel free to be generous with the flour. It is not going to be a dry dough, and you don't want it sticking to your hands. What you want to do is hold the dough on one end, stretch with one palm, pull it back, stretch, rotate, and repeat. All right, now that we've kneaded it, what I like to do is just tuck all of the edges under so that it's a nice smooth ball when we put it in a bowl to allow it to rise. I don't know if there's any name to this technique, but it is what I prefer to do. So just keep tucking it under into itself until you have a nice smooth ball. All right, this will help tuck those edges under and allow the dough to hold its shape. Now we're ready for our first rise. Here I have a glass bowl, some olive oil, and a paper towel. I'm just going to pour the olive oil, it's only about a tablespoon, into this bowl and brush it up the sides. The reason that I'm oiling the side of the bowl is because if this bread has to rise and it sticks to the sides of the bowl, you won't get a proper rise. So you want to make sure that you lightly grease it so that the bread can properly rise. Now I'll place this in the bowl and cover it with a dish towel and let it rise for about 2 to 3 hours until it has doubled in size. With recipes that have a time and an indicator, like I just said, 2 to 3 hours or double in size, make sure you pay attention to the indicator, not the time. Make sure you keep your eye out for it when it has doubled in size. If it's a cold kitchen, it will take longer. If it is a warm kitchen, it will take much less time. So depending on the environment that you're in, just look and see when this has doubled in size, and then we're ready for the next step. I already have one that has risen, so I'm going to turn it out onto my cutting board and show you the next step. Right, so here I have a dough that I made earlier, and just a note on if you're using plastic wrap. A tea towel is great. If you're using plastic wrap, just make sure you also oil the top of the dough ball because you don't want it to stick to the plastic wrap. It comes off nice and clean with that little bit of olive oil. So here I have my same spatula that I used earlier, the same cutting board with flour and the dough. You can tell this bowl is smaller than the other one, but I mean there's tons of bubbles in there. It has risen, it has doubled in size, and it looks great. So what we're going to do is just spread that flour out, lightly flour this surface as well. And this is the next step where we shape the loaf and get it ready for its second rise. So what I'm going to do is just turn it out onto the cutting board. You can see how easily it comes out because of the little bit of oil in there. And now what I'm going to do is just flour the top. During that first rise, all of those gases have formed in the dough and it will allow it to rise and have a nice beautiful crumb inside. So what we don't want to do is work this too much or flatten it out too much because then we'll basically lose all of the work of the first rise. So we're going to just shape this, but moving it as little as possible. What I like to do is just roll it kind of into a log and work it back and forth. Now that seam, I like to keep at the bottom, but again, rolling it so that it incorporates nicely, just shaping it. And you can still see the air bubbles on top, so I haven't disrupted them too much. All right. The second rise of this bread is going to be done right on the baking sheet that we're going to cook it with. So what I'm going to do is preheat my oven to 425 degrees and get that baking sheet. I have my baking sheet and just a little bit of semolina flour. I like to put that on the bottom of the baking sheet so that the bread doesn't stick. And it also gives the bread a little bit of crunch on the bottom when it is baked as well. So we'll spread that out and then move this loaf gently over to the baking sheet. All right. We'll reform the loaf if we need to, and then this is going to rise while our oven warms up to 425 degrees. So this will rise for about 20 to 25 minutes until the oven is preheated. It will just get a little bit puffy. It won't double in size like the first rise, but we'll cover it with a tea towel so that the exterior does not dry out. The bread is ready to go in the oven, and there are just two things I'm going to do before putting it in there. So first, you might be wondering what I'm doing with a saucepan of water. The trick to an extra crusty bread is putting a little bit of water in a saucepan beneath the bread as it cooks. The steam helps it form a beautiful crisp on the outside, and that is a trick that I love with this bread. Next, we're going to score the bread, or just make some slits in it. The reason that we do this is because as the bread bakes, those gases are going to expand. What we want to do is basically control where it expands on the loaf and help it maintain its structure. So, I mean, some people make beautiful sourdough artwork. I just like to make 3 little slits in there. And this is done right before it is put in the oven, because what you don't want is to do it too soon and those gases to escape the bread, and then it won't properly rise. So now what we're going to do is put this in a 425 degree oven for about 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll see how it comes out. Here it is, the finished product. The bread has a beautiful brown exterior. You can hear how crispy the crust is. I have some olive oil. I'm ready to dip it in and give it a taste. The bread has been sliced. I can't eat the heel. It's my husband's favorite part, so I'm saving it for him, but I am going to try a piece of this bread nonetheless. The exterior is really crisp, but it's thin, which is something that is a signifying factor of the Italian bread. The inside is also very, very tender though, and again, it will be something that can sop up olive oil or the sauce at the end of a meal. A perfect piece of bread, if you ask me. If you like this recipe, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.